On retourne, on va voir ce qu'on a. Oh. Voilà.
Good morning, Mr. Ridley. No, he's not here yet.
Bon.
No, I'll deal with Adam.
Ah. Il y avait un fantôme.
Almost there. Now for the tough part. The body needs
Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on va avoir comme dossier là?
Where's Ridley when you need him? All right. I just need some gloves and my apron. Then I can get to work.
Ah, mais quand...
I'm going to need my tape recorder for this.
Et on va enregistrer. Alors, ah, je dois enregistrer avant de... Et l'enregistrement vocal sur le bureau. Ah.
Autopsy dated November 22nd, 1991, 7:32 p.m. Led by Dr. Jack Hammond.
Parcourir les informations du dossier. Alors.
I begin by verifying the identity of the Jane Doe. It's most likely Harper Lloyd, age 35, found in a well-owned house by her neighbors Leonard and Dorothy Chelsea, reported missing for a week.
Ok.
Firefighters found the body after the Chelsea family began complaining that their tap water tasted strange, and at one point had begun to smell and turn a dark color.
Alors, là, il n'y a rien. Ici.
It is also known that the deceased was diagnosed with affective bipolar disorder. Harper was placed on drug therapy, which she dropped out of fairly regularly. During her treatment, she was under the care of her common law partner, Richard Benson, professional truck driver. The last person who had contact with the deceased was her partner. Harper's last message read as follows. I'm gonna take a shit in their stupid well. Then we'll see who has the last laugh. Nice one. Police records also show that Mrs. Lloyd was in constant conflict with her neighbors. The constant parties and subsequent brawls made living in the area nearly impossible, especially when Lloyd's partner wasn't around. I proceed to open the bag and check the most important task in forensic identification of a drowned person is to distinguish whether the death occurred before or after entering the water. Okay, that could have been worse. I carefully removed the victim's clothes so as not to damage the skin.
Elle devait aller chier dans le puits.
The deceased was found. One shoe was missing. I'm going to need the camera to document all possible suspicious marks.
Allez, on va récupérer notre appareil photo. Regardez ce qui...
Definitely the first thing that stands out is the very advanced post-mortem gigantism.
Photo. Alors. Okay.
The skin of the deceased appears very delicate, smooth, and relaxed from being in the water for a long time. The whole body is extremely pale.
Alors, visage.
There are bruises and hemorrhages on the neck. These usually occur due to increased inhalation when fighting to breathe underwater.
Tenta de respirer sous l'eau.
Post-mortem markings are seen on the underside of the body, that is, on the back, thighs, and calves of the deceased. It's likely that the deceased was lying on her back when she was fished out.
Sur le dos lorsqu'on l'avait repêché. Ça c'est la preuve que c'est.
The so-called washerwoman skin on the feet. The deceased had indeed been in the water for a long time.
Ah.
There are some obvious scratches on the skin.
manque une photo. Alors. Il me manque une photo quelque part. Il faut... Ah, la main.
The skin on the hands can be easily separated from the body. The separation takes the form of a glove.
Ok, donc là on a les 6. C'est parti, on va sûrement devoir le mettre sur le réglé. Hop. Hop. Voilà.
So, after the preliminary exam,
déjà on a
it's
notre
time to
première
take a
enquête.
closer look at this.
Réaliser l'autopsie. Alors, c'est parti.
The
Les
deceased
fins
was
étaient
closed.
vêtues.
Rigor mortis does
De
not need
vérifier
to be checked.
l'éligibilité du
Based on
cadavre,
the state of
l'état
decay,
d'introduction.
you can be sure it has subsided.
Ah, donc on peut même pas avoir à peu près combien de temps qu'elle est morte, puisque elle est décédée déjà le 15 novembre 91. Mais on peut pas avoir d'heure par rapport à l'eau habillée dans l'eau pendant plus d'une semaine. Disparition de la rigidité cadavérique. C'est quoi? Cadavérique. Elle a 35 ans, 40 kg, 1m60. Alors, examiner les zones. On va prendre notre petite loupe.
We see thick white foam in the mouth of the deceased, resulting from pulmonary edema. Foam is a characteristic in deaths due to drowning.
Même parce que sa langue, elle a gonflé.
There are obvious scratches on the skin, especially on the back and hands. These could be defensive wounds, evidence of some sort of altercation prior to death. The spots have a purplish blue-red hue, which is a typical sign of the death of the organism. Yep, pretty typical. Liver mortis are formed as a result of putrefaction of blood in the veins. No obvious signs of struggle. The skin on the hands would have easily peeled away from the flesh. Some of the fingers have already lost their nails.
Il m'en manque. Je crois que c'est au niveau des...
Due to the fact that the deceased was wearing shoes all the time, her feet are in better condition than her hands. Nevertheless, we can still notice a clear, wavy skin and the so-called washerwoman's skin texture. Okay, that's probably enough to indicate direction for further examination.
Ah. On va devoir dire où ils sont. T'es sûr?
I'd better note that down in the record. Marks found on the neck and foaming at the mouth are typical signs of drowning people.
Ici.
Those abrasions appear relatively fresh. No healing or scarring is visible.
Ici.
There doesn't seem to be anything unusual about this liver mortis. Hands heavily wrinkled from submersion in water. Typical washerwoman skin. Diffuse spots are caused by blood rotting in the veins. Considering the deceased's penchant for drinking alcohol, it could have been a mere accident.
Alors, au niveau des décès, il y a possibilité. Alors, signe typique de noyade, hématome, hémorragie sur le cou quand la victime a tenté de respirer sous l'eau. Mousse sortant de la bouche, là, noyade, rifure, entre mortem sur le bras et le dos. Pas de traces de cicatrisation. Intervention d'un tiers, donc quelqu'un qui essaie de la tuer. Tache post-mortelle gestative. Teinte rouge violâtre. La réapparition indique que la victime est restée longtemps sur le dos. Pas de traces d'empoisonnement.
Their distribution suggests that the victim was probably lying on her back when fished out of the water.
Alors, pour aider en raison d'un séjour prolongé dans l'eau. Macération de la peau, certains ongles manquants, pas de traces de lutte.
Fortunately, the skin on the hands didn't fall off. Otherwise, I'd have trouble identifying the deceased.
Indique que la victime est restée longtemps sur le dos, pas de traces d'empoisonnement.
Liver mortis of a different color can indicate poisoning with carbon monoxide, cyanides, or nitrates. However, a simple trip, loss of balance, and As a result,
Après, ça se peut quoi, elle
you
est
end
peut-être
up in a
tombée tout
deep
seul. Hein.
hole with no way out.
Bureau de
That's
médecin
all for
légiste.
now. Before I begin the dissection, I'll make sure the suggested identity is correct.
Alors, qu'est-ce que je dois faire là?
The suitcase with the fingerprint equipment should be around here somewhere.
Allez.
Scalpel, scissors, syringe, magnifying glass, knife.
Ah, prends les outils appropriés dans la mallette pour réaliser l'examen des empreintes digitales. Quelle mallette? Ah là.
Oh, here it is. With decomposing bodies, the tissue of the pads and the fingers tends to shrink. To remove these shrinkages, a mixture of glycerin or air is used. If the body of the deceased is well preserved, fingerprinting is similar to that of a the fingerprint sheet should always be checked. Slipping fingers, too much or too little ink, or inaccurate hand position can make fingerprints illegible. I'm going to conduct a dactyloscopic examination. If in fact the deceased is in the police database, I will find her. Glycerin is injected successively between the nail and the skin of each finger. The substance then enters the fingertip, removing shrinkage and wrinkles.
Ah ouais, en mettant ça, ça fait des empreintes. C'est stylé. Okay.
Now I take a brush. Only when the skin is taut and elastic can you use ink.
Ooh.
I think it's enough. In the case of drowning victims, you have to be extremely careful. The skin may fall off the hand like a glove when you take the print. I'll use the fax machine to add the print into the system.
Ah. Envoyer les empreintes digitales à Steve à l'aide du fax. Ah bah là.
Green button and... Once the data uploads, I'll run the prints against the police database on the computer. Great. The data is there.
Alors, charge.
Upload.
Là, on va chercher une empreinte qui coordonne. Comparer les empreintes digitales sur l'ordinateur à l'aide de la base des données de la police. Oui. Ah, celle-ci qui a l'air de correspondre. Faire glisser tous les points.
One more. Analyze button.
On analyse. Analyse.
And we have a result.
Alors, correspondant
Everyone
trouvé.
has a story to tell, even if it's just a police record.
Charge du dossier.
So,
Ah bah voilà, on a la dame.
as predicted, the deceased
Harper,
turned out to be Harper Lloyd.
née
That went smoothly.
en
I'll print this out and
1956,
attach it to the medical records.
américaine, femme, blonde, bleue, les yeux bleus, 9 28 91, dernière entrée. Alors, le 30 du 9 91, elle est décédée. Ah ouais, le 28 du 9... Ah ouais, ok, c'est un casier judiciaire. Le 28 du 9 80, trouble de l'ordre public comportant l'emprise de l'alcool. Trouble de l'ordre public, tapage, vandalisme. Comportement agressif, tapage, vandalisme. Okay. Vol à l'étalage. L'ordre public, ouais, ok, d'accord. Bon, on va l'imprimer. Et les résultats sur le fax.
Great. Now we can go back to my inspection.
Ce qu'il faut. Là, j'ai carrément son dos. Ah, on va reprendre l'autopsie maintenant.
I'm adding the name of the deceased.
Alors maintenant, on peut.
I'll start the internal examination by taking fluid from the victim's brain. A needle inserted through the nose will do the trick.
On va prendre la seringue. On va faire des prélèvements.
If the victim was alive when she fell into the well, she must have swallowed water fighting for her life, and then diatoms, characteristics of pooled water like a well, got into the body. In the meantime, I'll check the sample under the microscope. I'm sure that these algae traces will be found in the samples taken from the well where police found the body. Now I need to adjust the knobs properly and place the diatom in the center of the slide. Diatoms are single-celled microscopic algae.
Alors, déjà, on va essayer de...
The aperture still. I'm finally starting to see something here. It's not a dirty lens, I'm afraid, but rather, perfect. I won't even notice an army of diatoms from this distance.
Voilà.
Great. This way I'll see if I'm dealing with a large concentration of these algae. Nah, too much light. Oh, I'm finally starting to see something. The aperture still needs adjustment. The image is too dark. Oh, I'm finally starting to see something here. Nah, too much light. Oh, I'm finally starting to see. It's not a dirty lens, I'm afraid, but rather a bad focus.
Merci.
I won't even notice an army of diatoms from this distance. And perfect.
La mise au point, elle est bonne. Le zoom.
Great. This way I'll see if I'm dealing with a large concentration of these algae.
Je crois exactement.
As expected, we find the aforementioned algae in the solution. Their upper part, epitheca, which overlaps the lower, hypotheca, is clearly visible. The presence of diatoms in the brain samples taken indicate that the deceased was certainly alive when she fell into the water and was possibly conscious.
Et donc elle était vivante quand elle est dans le...
Since there were diatoms in the brain, it means that many more of them must have entered the body. Studies of the rest of the organs will most likely confirm this hypothesis. I can finally get to the practical part. I must be extra careful because the skin of the deceased is very stretched. I wouldn't want an explosion here. You can immediately see a very large swelling of the organs. In addition, it's easy to see that the ribs have been imprinted in the lungs. So, I'm going to start by drawing blood from the lung. If diatoms were only present in the lungs, this would mean that the victim was placed in the well after death, and the perpetrator wanted to get rid of the corpse in this way. Now, taking the lungs in my hand, I feel that the tissues have lost their elasticity, which is the result of water emphysema. In addition, there is significant swelling of the organs, and as a result, we have a nice imprint of the ribs. The emphysema itself, it's clear how far it's progressed, which is characteristic of drowning. Corpses found in water are worth examining with a tomograph. However, I can't count on such luxuries, so I must reach for a more archaic technology. A bucket and water.
Alors, puisque je dois localiser. Peut-être dans l'autre machine. Dans l'autre pièce. Il y a quelque chose ici. Non. C'est...
Who has anyone been here? I hope no one dipped a mop in it. It's best to go to the lab for this.
Bon.
Oh, Jesus.
Je n'ai pas ça, moi. Alors, je dois réaliser un test d'immersion. Et comment? Pas comment. À mon avis, ça doit être ici, puisque si elle m'a fait ça, c'est que ça peut être là.
My old but trusted centrifuge. Ideal for all the fluid tests I need, poor soul. I get cases like this more than any other. Scalpel, scissors, syringe, magnifying glass, knife. I guess I forgot to clean the knife.
Ah,
Historically, the lung float test is used to detect infanticide. The water should be at room temperature.
Oh, les sons, ils sont stylés. Hein.
That's enough. To test for this, I have to place the lungs in a container of water. This checks if there is air in the lungs. And speaking of lungs, everything is ready to bring them here.
C'est peut-être à ce moment-là que j'aurais dû venir. Je suis peut-être venu trop tôt. Allez, on va prendre.
Of course, such a study isn't without flaws. Air may have entered a newborn's airways during resuscitation attempts. Gas is released during decomposition. In this case, however, it's about something else. Namely, the amount of fluid in the lungs.
Alors,
to test for this, I have to place the lungs in a container of water and wait to see if they fall or if they will float on the surface. Just as I assumed, the lungs collapsed easily.
On va devoir les disséquer maintenant.
Fluid could have entered the lungs during panic attempts to catch breath underwater, but it could also be the result of bacterial infections or cancer, so further investigation is needed. I move on to dissecting the lungs of the deceased.
Oh, boys.
You can hear the distinct, very unpleasant crackling of the tissues being cut through. The parenchyma is remarkably pale, although small hemorrhagic foci and petechia are present on the surface.
Alors, disséquer les poumons.
All right. Now, I will check the collected fluid under a microscope. If we find 20 diatoms on the slide, it can be considered drowning, and our result is not false positive due to possibly aperture. Oh, I'm finally starting to see something here, and perfect. I won't even notice an army of diatoms from this distance. Great. This way I'll see if I'm dealing with a large concentration of these algae. As expected. In solution, the diatoms are clearly visible. There are smaller and larger clusters of them. There will definitely be more than 20 of them.
Ok, donc j'ai trouvé ce qu'il y avait.
I'll make a note of all this.
Autopsie.
So far, this case looks pretty standard. It's clear from the beginning that it's drowning. Well, the procedure requires me to check everything anyway.
L'examen des poumons indique une noyade sèche. De plus, l'analyse relève des grands de vin.
So, I move on to checking the other organs. I ligate the heart, and then remove it for strongly developed putrefactic hemolysis. The organ can be seen at first glance. Apart from that, no signs of a heart attack or other heart disease.
Le cœur sans trace de maladie.
I move on to the next organ. This time, it's the liver. It's immediately apparent that the deceased didn't care for herself. Like most organs, the beginnings of cirrhosis are visible in some areas. I transfer the organ to a board and proceed to dissect.
Allez, on va découper le foie. Hop.
The cross-section clearly shows dilated veins and many small hemorrhagic foci. I must admit that this is quite a feat,
Alors,
considering the rather young age of the deceased. Harper enjoyed drinking so much that she might not have lasted a few more years.
Avec une veine dilatée, alcoolisme.
I move on to the stomach. I take a sample of the fluid for testing. It looks very turbid. I'll see what happens after spinning. That's in a moment. Now, I carefully ligate the organ, then cut it off. It's enlarged, probably full of putrid gases. I transfer it to the board and carefully open it, checking the contents.
Checker l'estomac. Par contre, celui-là, c'est long. Non, pas descendre.
One thing you'd never get used to is how much this task smells. Okay, the stomach is full of fluid and unidentified organic matter, which is probably leftover food. So let's check the diatoms. Again. But in a centrifuge for a change. The problem with examining drowned people is being able to show whether the death was due to drowning or whether something else contributed to the death. Cramp, heart attack, drugs, homicide, or some accident. Such an analysis requires viewing from different angles and a careful interpretation of the collected data, including those from the field. That's why it's so important to collect as many samples as possible. Okay. This is one last little sample. Now,
une seule à mettre.
set.
Configurer les valeurs pour faire tourner la centrifuge. Les valeurs de quoi, non? Haine. La colle. 15. Bah, c'est 15 minutes, hein. C'est vraiment 15 minutes. 15 secondes, non, mais... Ah, c'est celui-là. 35 minutes, 25%. 35 minutes, 25%. Heureusement que j'ai regardé, hein. 35. Il y a 25. Voilà. Activé. Bon. Je regarde toujours derrière au cas où, on sait jamais.
Done. I'll run it directly into the chromatograph and run it against the data from the police. I'm certain the analysis will show similarities between the fluid and water in Chelsea's well.
Alors, passer l'échantillon dans le rack. Il y a du bruit. Par contre, voilà, je regarde si c'était du... Combien je crois que c'était 3 mm, je crois. Voilà, c'est ça. Pas 3 mm.
Let me think. 3 milliliters should be fine.
Et... Oh. Voilà, 3 mm.
Okay, now it's the chromatograph's turn.
Allez, on va faire les 1, 3. Oh. On fait. Merci beaucoup d'avoir regardé cette vidéo là, donc n'hésitez pas à cliquer sur abonnez-vous et cliquez aussi sur la petite cloche pour avoir les prochaines notifications. Donc si vous aimez cette chaîne, vous aurez 2 vidéos à votre disponibilité, soit la vidéo de droite, soit la vidéo de gauche, mais si vous aimez vraiment la chaîne, il y en a énormément et il y a beaucoup de vidéos, donc n'hésitez pas à continuer à regarder cette chaîne. Je vous remercie, bonne journée.